Pleasant evening, everyone. What a rainy night tonight. And there's plenty of rainfall, and COVID cases are rising once again. But praise God, because we have our event and we are pushing through. And of course, we are so blessed to have you here with us, the few of you here. And we are also very blessed to have with us here Dr. Calum Miller from the United Kingdom to answer this question: is abortion a human right? Look forward to Dr. Miller's presentation and a 30-minute Q&A right after. For those who are with us here, you may address your questions later through the microphone here at the center. But if you're shy, you can always talk to me and Omar privately. For those who are watching us on Facebook, you can send your questions through the comments section of the live feed, or you can send a direct message to the Reasonable Faith page. So if you want to be more private and if you don't want others to see, if you don't want to disclose your identity and you want to send anonymously, kindly send a private message to our Facebook page, Reasonable Faith Philippines, Quezon City Chapter. And of course, for those who are with us here again, feel free to grab some food over there at the registration counter. And if you haven't really registered yet, kindly approach Fleo right here, beautiful lady over there wearing black, to register. Okay, and for those who are, we would also like to notify everyone that our event is being streamed live on Facebook. So I hope that you can open your social media accounts and share our live stream again at Reasonable Faith Philippines Quezon City Chapter here on Facebook. I'm sure you're excited to hear Dr. Miller tonight. But before that, let me introduce to you to my friend and Reasonable Faith Philippines Quezon City Chapter Chapter Director, Omar Arellano, for a few words before we begin.
Thank you, Genesis. So again, good evening, and my name is Omar. I am the Chapter Director of Reasonable Faith here in the Philippines. So what I'll do is first, I will introduce the organizations that are represented that made this event possible, and we will also introduce our speaker. So before I do that, I would just like to acknowledge Pastor Renato Paran, Life Coach Director, and Sister Cecilia Paran, missionary. We also have Pastor Bayani Esguerra, Senior Pastor of WIN-Makati. So thank you. So I will now proceed to the different organizations. So the first one is Ratio Christi. It comes from the Latin word reason for Christ. So it is a global movement that equips university students and faculty to give historical, philosophical, and scientific reasons for believing in Jesus Christ. What they want to do is to have a renaissance of Christian thinking in the university. So if you know people who are interested, especially those in the University of the Philippines, Diliman, please feel free to contact Ratio Christi if you want to know how to defend the faith. Next is Reasonable Faith, and Reasonable Faith aims to provide in the public arena an intelligent, articulate, and uncompromising, yet gracious Christian perspectives on the most important issues concerning Christianity today. So some of those issues are the existence of God, the meaning of life, the objectivity of truth, the foundation of moral values, the creation of the universe, intelligent design, the reliability of the Gospels, the uniqueness of Jesus, the historicity of the resurrection, and the challenge of religious pluralism. Next, Burke Institute. Burke Institute aims to promote the idea that human flourishing can only be achieved in an environment of liberty that is grounded on religious truth through the conduct of seminars, conferences, for publishing and research. So this organization is responsible for helping Christians think from a Christian worldview about politics. And last but not the least, Canopy Global, a nonprofit organization providing a varied canopy of services to support the health of the individual and family, relieve the suffering of the most vulnerable, and promote cooperation and peace among all people. So what I'll do now, I'll introduce some of the services that Canopy Global gives, since this is the organization where our speaker belongs. So, for example, in human trafficking and intimate partner violence prevention, they can help us in treating its victims cross-culturally and internationally in community, clinic, and hospital settings. They also provide physician experts and speakers for leaders around the world regarding specific ways to prevent, recognize, and care for victims of human trafficking. They also aid development of government, business, hospital, and community-specific plans or policies to prevent, recognize, and treat victims of human trafficking using holistic trauma-informed model. They also foster creation of shelters for survivors of abuse. Aside from that, they also do activities that are pro-women and in strengthening the families. This includes treatment of women that seek abortion care. They provide resources in assisting those women in their pregnancy journey, and they also treat survivors of abortion cross-culturally and internationally in community, clinic, and hospital settings. They provide physician expert and speakers for leaders around the world regarding medical research about the risks of abortion and how to prevent abortion. They emphasize that every life matters, which includes the life of the parents. And just a side note, our speaker has a blog called calumsblog.org. So it is spelled calumsblog.org. So it has resources that answer questions about abortion. It also has videos, resources about bioethics, academic papers, and newspaper contributions. So you can check that if you want to learn more. And they also provide services in aiding the development of government, business, hospital, and community-specific plans or policies to prevent abortion, solve crisis situations, and in strengthening families. They foster growth for clinics and maternal homes in helping women with unplanned pregnancy. So those are some of the services, and if you want to know more about it, you can check their website on canopyglobal.org. So to introduce our speaker, he's the International Director of Canopy Global. He's based in London and he directs their international programming, aiding politicians and other leaders around the world in creating strategies to protect individuals from human trafficking, intimate partner violence, and abortion. He graduated from the University of Oxford Medical School in 2015. He currently works as a medical doctor in the UK, and he also teaches philosophy at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on abortion policy in practice. He also holds a master's degree with distinction in biblical studies. He has given over 40 academic presentations internationally. He has taken part in multiple debates, which includes against the CEO of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, which is the largest abortion provider in the UK. He has also published on different topics such as maternal mortality in the developing world, the ethics of voting on abortion, animal and fetal pain, abortion and mental health, telemedicine abortion, academic freedom, and the philosophy of religion. He has received prizes from the University of Oxford and Royal College of Psychiatrists for his work on bioethics. For that, let's give a warm welcome and applause for our speaker, Dr. Calum Miller.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you especially for such a difficult topic. And I know it's been probably a busy week so far for everyone, so thank you. This is obviously a topic which maybe for the last few decades has not really come up in the Philippines in a major way, because most people in the Philippines consider themselves pro-life, maybe not using that terminology, but they believe that there is some value to the child in the womb or the fetus. And of course, abortion is not permitted in the Philippines. But of course, this conversation is coming up increasingly, so that we hear on campuses, among young people especially, there is really the thought that abortion is liberating for women, and there is the thought that this is profoundly important. And so we anticipate this becoming a major social issue in the next few years. And therefore, of course, it's critically important that we think carefully about it, that we're aware of the evidence on it, and that we hear the perspectives from the charitable perspective of listening to the evidence for them, listening to the arguments for them. So, in terms of the global perspective, the Philippines, of course, is one of many countries which does not permit abortion, which gives legal protection to the unborn child. And this is in contrast to many Western countries, to many parts of, I guess, Northern Asia in particular. But as you can see in the countries in red and yellow, Most countries in Africa, many countries in South and Southeast Asia, and some countries in the Caribbean and Latin America do give that legal protection to the child. And so, therefore, we have to look at this in a global context, that there is a trend towards legalizing abortion, and we need to look at this in the Philippines, that there is significant international pressure, there is a shift of views among young people, and therefore we have to be aware of possible debates in the future. Just as an example of this, this is a survey of medical students from Jordan, a conservative Islamic country, and they said 80% of them, or just over 3/4, said that every conceived child has the right to be born. But at the same time, when they asked the students whether laws and legislation will support abortion in the future because of changes in the culture, over 1/3 of them said yes, it will. And so really all over the world in the most conservative places, this conversation is happening, and it will come around in the Philippines in the public sooner than we think. So how should we think about this issue? Well, I think it's helpful to think of it as a justice issue. Everyone can relate to issues of justice. So Martin Luther King said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Whatever affects one person directly affects everyone indirectly. So what he's saying is that when injustice occurs, we can't just ignore it and pretend it's in another part of the country, a corner of society, and that it doesn't affect us. Injustice will always go throughout communities and affect everyone. And in fact, this is what we see on the topic of abortion, and I want to suggest some ways in which that happens. But what does justice mean? Well, justice means, in the first place, treating everyone equally with dignity. That's a central part of it. And this is in some ways what the pro-life perspective is about. It says that every human being should be treated equally with dignity, no matter how big it is, no matter how developed it is, no matter how intelligent it is. But justice is also about healing and restoring broken or difficult relationships. And this is a very, very important part, particularly because abortion can be thought of as a broken relationship between the mother and the child, and indeed between the rest of society. As an example, any parent knows that when a child is hurt, they hurt as well, and their whole family is hurt, and often their community is hurt. I recently watched an interview of Chris Rock's mum after Will Smith slapped him a few months ago. And Chris Rock's mum said, "Will Smith didn't just hurt my son. He hurt me, and he hurt all of our family," because that is part of what being a family is about, and what being part of a community is about. When injustice occurs to one person, especially a child, everyone is worse off. And so the pro-life perspective really says that the same is true on the question of abortion, that when a child is hurt, their mother is hurt, their family is hurt, and their community is hurt as well. So people on both sides sometimes try to portray this as a battle between the mother and the child. The pro-choice side might say that the mother's rights are more important, and the pro-life side says that the child's rights are more important. But actually, this isn't really the debate, because the pro-life side says that both lives matter. It says that women deserve better than abortion, and it says that abortion, rather than being an individual bad choice by one person, is a societal failure to love and support a woman to continue her pregnancy. Now, this is important that we discuss this issue with the utmost compassion and sensitivity for many reasons. But one of the reasons is that it is so common. So in the Western world, throughout the Western world, including my own country, the UK, 1 in 3 women in their lives will have an abortion, and 1 in 4 pregnancies will end in abortion, which means that 1/4 of my own generation is missing in the UK as a result. This means that there are 200,000 abortions a year. In the US, it's more like 800,000 or 900,000. Now, we know that in pro-life countries that protect children, we know that the number of abortions is significantly lower, because there is very good evidence that pro-life laws do work. They do prevent many, many abortions, most abortions, in fact. But they still happen, and probably all of us know someone who is affected by this. So abortion is common, and so not only does it end the lives of 200,000 fetuses or embryos or children, whatever you want to call them. It also means that there are 200,000 women a year in the UK hurting as a result of abortion, and 200,000 fathers who have also been affected, whether because they have coerced the abortion or encouraged it or paid for it, or maybe it happened in some cases against their choice or against their desires. So I want then to say a little bit about how abortion affects women. I made these grand promises earlier that we can show that abortion is empirically harmful to women, that rather than liberating them, it actually led to the immiseration of women in many ways, and actually captivated them in the wrong way, that it caused them to suffer significant burdens in society that they didn't necessarily suffer before. So the first example is with sex-selective abortion. This is where the baby is aborted, not because it's unhealthy, not because the parents don't want the child, just because it's the wrong sex. And almost always, this is sex-selective abortion of girls. It's almost unheard of for there to be sex-selective abortion of boys. And so the United Nations Population Fund is a very pro-abortion kind of entity related to the United Nations. And I say pro-abortion rather than pro-choice because actually, when you look at their history, it has fundamentally been about population control, about reducing the population regardless of whether that is in line with what a woman actually wants. And so they note that today around 126 million women are missing around the world, and they say it's the result of son preference and gender-biased sex selection. They say that some areas have seen up to 25% more male births than female births. And of course, there's no way to prevent female births deliberately other than through abortion. So we know that there are 2 million missing female births every year, or nearly 2 million, which means that there are nearly 2 million baby girls aborted just because they are girls every year around the world. Which means that abortion is in fact one of the most powerful tools or even weapons that misogynistic forces and people and entities have used in order to eradicate the voice and the visibility and even the very presence of women in society. Now, this happens mostly in countries like China and India, but it also happens in Western countries. We know that it happens in the UK. And in fact, there was a parliamentary vote to ban sex-selective abortion 7 years ago in the UK, and our parliament voted to keep it legal. And this is in a supposedly pro-choice, pro-women country. Now, of course, this doesn't just affect those baby girls who have their lives ended. It also has implications for those women who survive, because in many places in the world, there are no girls born. In some villages in India and China, not a single girl is born over a period of perhaps several years as a result of this. And so what we see in those places is that the men who grow up cannot find partners. And of course, this is a wicked and evil solution. In fact, it's not a solution at all. But what they do in response is they kidnap and traffic women from other areas and other countries so that they have people to marry or even just have sex with and then abandon and mistreat. And so what we see is that in the first place, nearly 2 million baby girls never get the chance to live in the first place. And those girls who do survive often end up being trafficked and abused so that they can serve the needs of men. And so women are the victims, ultimately, of this arrangement. Now, we know that the second way in which abortion has been harmful to women is through coercion. Now, this is particularly striking because legal abortion is seen as a way of liberating women and giving them choice. But the reality is much more complex. In fact, when abortion is legal, we know that around a quarter of abortions are forced on women against their will by a male partner, by a teacher, by an employer, by a pimp, by the parents, or even by the doctors or abortion providers. Now, that is just the overt coercion. But many women are pressured into abortion more subtly. So they would want to keep the child. In fact, most women want to keep the child in better circumstances, but their circumstances or other people push them towards abortion. As an example, in Scotland, which is generally seen as an extremely feminist and egalitarian country, 3/4 of pregnant women and new mothers in Scotland say that they have experienced discrimination because of their pregnancy and because of their baby. And what that means is that even if no one is telling these women, you have to have an abortion, they know that if they don't, they will lose a promotion, they will get demoted, they might even be fired, they might be given less meaningful work, and certainly they will be undervalued. And of course, this does not ultimately facilitate women's choice and is only really an option when abortion is legal. In Ireland, we saw that when abortion was legal, within months, female pilots were told that they would be fired if they got pregnant and didn't have an abortion. And that did not happen before abortion was legalized in Ireland. Now, we know as well that, in fact, this pressure comes from abortion providers themselves. So this is one of the leading abortion providers in the world, probably the biggest in the world, and one of the leading abortion providers in the UK, Marie Stopes International, which is named after Marie Stopes, who incidentally was a famous eugenicist and admirer of Hitler. So that, in fact, I'm not making this up, they recently changed their name because of this. So they acknowledge it. They changed their name to MSI, which obviously stands for Marie Stopes International, but of course doesn't explicitly say her name anymore. Well, what about this organization? They were observed by hospital regulators in the UK, which generally means that they're on their best behavior. But what the hospital regulators found was that when they went there, the abortion provider had a target for abortions. In fact, they said 98 to 100% of women coming into our clinic should have an abortion. And if they don't, then we are failing. In fact, they paid staff bonuses and said that we will give you more money if you reach these abortion targets. And so the staff at this pro-choice abortion provider themselves explicitly said that this corporate focus on achieving KPIs, performance indicators, worked against the concept of patient choice. That was the exact language that they used, that their culture at the leading abortion provider in England worked against patient choice. In fact, they went further in the regulator's report, and they said that consent was routinely accepted from children without proper assessment of their ability to understand the risks. And of course, we know that uninformed consent is not consent at all. So these are abortions routinely performed on children without valid consent, which of course does not uphold their choice. Now, there was a particularly harrowing example just a few years ago. This was a woman who was 22 weeks pregnant, which in the UK means that if she had given birth at that very moment, there was a good chance the child would survive, maybe about 30%. This woman, however, had a mild learning difficulty, so although she was in her 20s, she had a mental age of somewhere between 6 and 12, and reports differ on that. But she knew that she had a baby, she knew what a baby was, she could communicate her preferences, her mother was a midwife who said we can take care of the baby, the social worker said yes, this family is capable of taking care of a baby, but the doctors disagreed. And the doctors said, yes, of course it is your body, but it is not your choice, it is our choice, because we think you would be better having an abortion. And so, of course, the woman said no, and the doctors, as a result, took her to court. And so the doctors took her to court, where the judge said, I know you want the baby, but you have to have an abortion against your will. Now, this is in a pro-choice culture, but what is particularly chilling is that the judge in this case was previously a lawyer for the UK's leading abortion provider. So the UK's leading abortion provider had lawyers previously who had this attitude towards a woman's choice, which of course does not respect the woman's choice at all. And they even said in the report that to try and appease the woman, the doctors said that they would give her a doll to play with rather than her baby, which of course is no replacement at all. Now, the third way in which abortion has been harmful to a woman is through the impact on her mental health. Now, you will find the leading medical authorities saying that there is no relationship between abortion and mental health. I'm sure they will say that, and I will give you the evidence otherwise, but even that admission itself is an admission that abortion does not help mental health. If there is no association, then abortion does not help a woman's mental health. But actually, what the best research shows is that there is in fact a relationship. This was the leading researcher in the world. He passed away a few years ago, but if you read any of the major reviews, the systematic reviews which actually look at this subject, they will tell you that his research is the best research on this topic. And he was pro-choice. He said abortion should be legal, it's a woman's choice, I'm not pro-life by any means. But he said we have to be honest about the scientific evidence. And he said that at the present time, there is no credible scientific evidence demonstrating that abortion has mental health benefits. But in fact, he actually went significantly further. When he compared women who were the same in every respect, they had the same social background, the same economic background, they both had unwanted pregnancies, they both had the same mental health history. He found that the women who had abortions had a 30% increased risk of anxiety, a 70% increased risk of suicide, 130% increased risk of alcohol abuse, and 300% increased risk of drug abuse. Now, this was his objective results from the very best study published on this topic, and there are not many good studies published on this subject. But what other studies show, again, some of them from pro-choice researchers, is that 1.5 to 14% of women who have an abortion get post-traumatic stress disorder directly as a result. Now, we know that there is a causal relationship because post-traumatic stress disorder is specific to a traumatic event. And in this case, the symptoms were specific to abortion. Now, it sounds like a small percentage, but according to the official classification of side effects and complications, this counts as common or very common. And when you count the number of abortions that occur, this means that between 12,000 and 120,000 women in the US every single year develop PTSD as a result of abortion. By contrast, what happens when a woman is denied an abortion? This is talked about as forced pregnancy, forced birth. It is talked about in terms that suggest that this is the worst thing that could happen to a woman, to be pregnant against her will. And of course, to be made pregnant against a woman's will is indeed horrendous. Sexual crime and sexual violence is horrific and heinous, and of course, causes immense trauma to women. But what about a woman who is already pregnant, who already has a human life growing inside of her? If she is protected and restricted from having an abortion, is her life ruined as a result? Is it traumatic and distressing? Well, researchers looked at this question. These were pro-choice researchers, and in fact, they studied women who went to get abortion and were turned away. And so they called the study the Turnaway Study. And if you read any newspaper article about abortion research in the last 5 years, it will probably mention this study. Now, what they found when they tried to show that turning a woman away from an abortion caused her all sorts of problems in the future, what they actually found was that when they asked women themselves in their own words 5 years later, what happened? Firstly, 3/4 of those women said that they kept the baby. So most women do not go and get an illegal abortion. Most women do not go to another country or another state to get an abortion. Most women, when they can't get an abortion, have the baby. And this is decisive evidence that pro-life laws do work. They save thousands and thousands of lives. But what about the woman? Did it cause her immense distress? Well, actually, no. The researchers were surprised to find that of those women who kept the baby and raised the child, 98% of them said that they were glad they were refused an abortion and ended up having the baby. 98% of them. And this was incidentally higher than the number of women who said that they were glad that they had the abortion. And so the reality is that women are resilient to these changes. Yes, a pregnancy in an unintended time can be distressing. It can be deeply distressing and cause profound panic. And that makes sense, and women in that situation should be given the utmost support and time. But the reality is that abortion is a permanent solution to a very temporary problem. Thank you. Ultimately, when a woman is given time and support, the woman is resilient to her circumstances and comes to terms with them, and in 98% of cases is glad that she eventually had the baby and was not given the abortion that she originally wanted. Now, it's sometimes claimed that abortion is healthcare for the reason that abortion is many times safer than giving birth, and there may be some senses in which this is true. But this doesn't look at healthcare in a holistic way. Women do not just have direct complications of pregnancy or childbirth. They have complications of many different things, and many factors go into a woman's emotional and mental and psychological and physical well-being. So what we find is that these statistics that claim that abortion is much safer count the statistics in completely inconsistent ways. Here's one example. The leading cause of maternal death after childbirth in many countries is suicide. It's nothing to do with the physical complications of childbirth. The main cause of maternal death in many countries is suicide. But when you look at the statistics for deaths after abortion, they never count suicides after abortion, which means that the primary cause of maternal death is not even counted when you look at deaths after abortion. And this is hugely important, as we'll see. Women who do not ever get pregnant have a baseline suicide rate. But women who become pregnant have a much lower than average suicide rate because having a baby is protective against suicide. And this is well known that being a parent is one of the strongest protective factors against suicide. But women who have abortions don't just go back up to the average suicide rate, their suicide rate is much higher still. And because suicide is the leading cause of maternal death, the mortality rate overall shows exactly the same pattern. That women who become pregnant have a much lower than average mortality rate, and women who have abortions have a much higher than average mortality rate. And this data is from Finland, where abortion is widely available and widely accepted, and the statistics are extremely good and well documented. Now, you might think that this is just the psychological outcomes, but that is still important because psychological causes of death, like suicide, are the leading cause of maternal death. But even when you look at physical health alone, the mortality rate after childbirth and after abortion is the same. And there are many reasons for this. One is that there is something called the healthy pregnant women effect, which is that when a woman becomes pregnant and has a child, she is much less likely to smoke, much less likely to do drugs, much less likely to take alcohol, much less likely to take risks. And for all of these reasons, and because she has more contact with the health services, what you find is that any of the physical disadvantages of pregnancy are actually completely compensated for by the physical health advantages of having a child. And it seems counterintuitive, but this is what the data very clearly show. The next way that abortion has been harmful to women is through its increase in the risk of preterm birth for future pregnancies. When a baby is born too early, sometimes passes away as a result, or in other cases has lifelong complications, or at least early complications as a result. Now, this is important because preterm birth is the leading cause of death for children under the age of 5 around the world, causing 1 million deaths every year. But what is known is that when you only look at the extra preterm births caused by abortion, and even when you only look at the very early preterm births, which is a small category among those, abortion in the US is responsible for over 20,000 extra very early preterm births a year, an extra 2,000 cases of cerebral palsy as a result of that preterm birth, and the economic cost alone of that is over $1 billion every year. So we know that there is a link between abortion and preterm birth. This is not controversial. This is agreed by pretty much every authority in the field. Now, the final way that I'm going to speak about, which is not the only other way that abortion has been harmful to women, is through its impact on the culture and the society much more generally. Now, this is a little bit more complex, so please do bear with me. We know that when abortion is legalized, it causes immense changes in how people behave with each other. They feel much more free to have sex in situations where they are not ready for a child. And so the first thing we see is that there is a huge increase in unwanted pregnancies. Now, everyone agrees that unwanted pregnancies are bad for women. They cause significant distress. And the legalization of abortion causes more unwanted pregnancies. But here's the difference that is particularly striking. Before abortion is legalized, typically if there is an unwanted pregnancy, the man feels more responsibility to look after that child. But when abortion is legalized, what has been found is that the man can suddenly say, parenthood is optional for you, and so it's also optional for me, and so I'm going to walk away. I know this is your body and it's your choice, and for the same reason, it is your responsibility and it is your burden. So what you find is not only that there are many more unwanted pregnancies, but beforehand, those unwanted pregnancies and the burdens from them fell on the shoulders of the man and the woman together. Of course, that's not always true, but it's more true when abortion is not available. But when abortion is available, you have even more unwanted pregnancies, and this time, there is no one to share that burden. The burdens of those fall entirely on the woman. And so what we have seen in most Western countries is a massive increase in single motherhood and the breakdown of family as a result. Now, what you don't see is many single fathers in the West. You, of course, don't see men getting these distressing and difficult abortions. All of these consequences fall entirely on the woman. And in fact, they have been shown to push many of those women into poverty as a result. Because rather than having the man's physical, financial, social, emotional, and otherwise general support, now the woman has to do everything by herself, and of course will be in significantly worse economic positions as a result. And so the biggest losers in this arrangement are women, and especially the poorest women, who are most at risk from going into poverty. Now, this isn't just my conclusion or speculation. This is a paper from the 1990s by a Nobel Prize-winning economist and his wife, who is now the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States government. So both of them very solidly pro-choice. But what they say is that in 1970, the permanent cure to poverty seemed to be on the horizon in the United States of America. But just as they were going to cure poverty permanently in America, there was a massive increase in single motherhood and the feminization of poverty, meaning women specifically going into poverty as a result of being single mothers. There wasn't an increase in men in poverty. There wasn't an increase in single fathers. There was an increase in single mothers taking all the burden and the feminization of poverty. And so abortion, when it's made legal, has pushed some of the most vulnerable women into much more economic difficulty, which is particularly striking when you think that abortion is often used as an argument to help the poorest women. In fact, what happens in reality is the opposite. Now, of course, the poverty and the economic consequences are not the only consequences of family breakdown. We know that the family is the fundamental building block of a healthy society. And we know, therefore, that when families break down, there is a mountain of empirical evidence that everyone is worse off. We know that when it comes to mental health, the mental health of the mother and of the father and of the children is all worse when families break down, including suicide and other horrendous difficulties. We know that the child, particularly the boys, are more likely to be involved in violent crime if they don't have an intact family. And even the father is more likely to be involved in violent crime, because one thing that keeps many men from crime is having the responsibility of a child and a family to take care of. Now, of course, men should not need to have a child and a family to keep them from crime. No man should commit violent crime, especially just because they don't have a family. But the sad empirical reality is that this does in fact occur as a phenomenon, that when men do not have that responsibility, many of them do turn to crime. And of course, some of the primary victims of violent crime by men are, of course, women, once again. Finally, we know that there's a huge increase in sexually transmitted diseases when abortion is legalized. So it's been shown in 30 countries around the Western world that when abortion has been legalized, the changes in behavior have caused a 60% or maybe even higher increase in sexually transmitted diseases, which in the UK we typically think of them as not particularly important. But when you think about the fact that around a quarter of young people in the UK have a sexually transmitted disease, that many of these can cause infertility or PID or various other problems. When you think about the fact that some of them are more serious, like HIV causing potentially immunodeficiency and death, or HPV causing cervical cancer, an increase in sexually transmitted diseases is a serious public health problem. It's not just a thing that conservatives scaremonger about. It's a leading public health crisis in Western countries that they do take extremely seriously. So then I want to say just a little bit about the reality of abortion in a Western country, or a typical Western country. As I said, in the UK, it's a typical country in the West, but has very good abortion statistics. We know that there are 200,000 abortions a year, that 1 in 3 women in their lifetime will have an abortion, that 1 in 4 pregnancies ends in abortion, and that of these abortions, about 40% are repeat abortions, meaning that they're the second or third, sometimes 10th or 11th abortions that someone has had. Now, we know that of these 200,000, at most 100 abortions are done to save the life of the woman, a tiny, tiny fraction of 1%. And when you look at those in detail, actually many of them are not medically necessary either. Likewise, when it comes to abortions as a result of sexual crime, these are a tiny fraction of 1%. About 1 to 2% are because the child has a disability, but this can be any disability at all. So in the UK, if you have something like a cleft lip, which can be surgically corrected and cause no further problems, the baby can be aborted any time before birth or during birth in the UK and in many other Western countries. For a healthy child that doesn't have any disability, they can still be aborted for any reason up to 6 months, which is a few weeks past viability. That can be for any reason at all, including because the baby is a girl. Now, because the UK has a weird system of classification, it technically says you can only have an abortion for health reasons. Most of these are described as mental health abortions, but the reality is that includes anything up to 6 months. If you say that having a baby girl would affect my mental health, abortion is legal in the United Kingdom. So some of the other abuses, sorry, I'm not sure what happened to the slide there, but some of the other abuses we've seen in the UK are particularly striking as well. As I said, we've seen sex-selective abortion. We have seen that partial birth abortion is legal, where a baby is delivered, and during delivery, forceps are put into its head and its brains are sucked out. We have seen that in some cases, abortions fail and the baby is born alive, and the baby is simply left to die. In the Netherlands, if the baby is disabled and is born alive, infanticide is legal. You can actually actively kill the child with a drug if the child is disabled once it's born. In many cases, actually, it was found a few years ago that the babies were not given burials or cremated. They were actually sent to be incinerated so they could heat hospitals with the energy from using them as fuel. So then finally, I just want to spend a bit of time coming back to this ethical question. I've said a lot about the impact of abortion on women, and I said that much of this actually derives from the fact that this is fundamentally an injustice to the child. But many people see this as a religious claim or a controversial philosophical claim. You know, when people say life begins at fertilization or conception, it's seen as, you know, just what the Catholic Church teaches. And I should say I'm not myself Catholic, so there's one slight counterexample already. But hopefully this will help explain in a way that makes sense from anyone's perspective. International human rights law says very clearly, this is a binding treaty that almost every country in the world has signed. It's not widely known, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights actually has no legal force whatsoever. It's just a declaration. This is the actual treaty in international law that puts the Universal Declaration into law. It says every human being has the inherent right to life and that this right shall be protected by law. It doesn't say we're pro-life, but if there's an inconvenience or if someone wants a choice, they can end the life of another human being. It says this right shall be protected by law. And so what this means is that the central ethical question is this: is the fetus or the embryo a human being? If it's not, it doesn't really matter because it doesn't have the right to life. But if it is a human being, not a potential human being, not a potential life, if it is an actual existing human being, then it has the inherent right to life and it shall be protected by law. So what exactly do we mean when we say that life begins at conception, or that this is a human being with the right to life? Because bacteria are alive, but they don't have a right to life. Skin cells are alive, in many cases, not always, but they don't have an inherent right to life, even though they're living and they're human. So what do we actually mean when we say that something is a human being that has a right to life? Well, we can answer that by asking what we are, because we are human beings with a right to life. So what are we? Well, we are human beings, which means that we are individual organisms of the species Homo sapiens. We are individual members of the human family. And so the question is the fetus an individual organism of the species Homo sapiens? Now that is a scientific question. It's not a religious view, it's not a philosophical position, it's not a personal opinion, it's a scientific question. And this makes sense because biology just is the study of life. That's what biology means. But there was a researcher in the US who wanted to prove this. So he was from the University of Chicago and he asked the public, who should define the beginning of life? And he found that 80% of the public agreed that this was a biological, scientific question. So he then, as a result, went to ask 5,500 biologists. He said, when does life begin? By which I mean, when does an individual human organism begin to exist? And what he found was that 95% of them said that a new organism is created at fertilization. 95%. There is not controversy about this in the biological community. He wanted to check that he didn't just ask the pro-life biologists, he didn't just go to UST and find all the pro-life ones. He asked them, where do you stand on abortion? And some of them, many of them were pro-choice or even very pro-choice. And he found that even the large majority of the very pro-choice biologists still agreed that a human being began to exist at fertilization. So this is not a philosophical or religious claim. So I then want to finish just by saying a little bit about the landmarks of development in the womb. Now we know that these do not determine a human being. It is not a human being and it's not alive because it has a heartbeat, because it has a brain, because it can feel pain. But what this shows is that from the very beginning, this is a developing, growing, and maturing human being. And I want to try and illustrate that with just a few examples. So the first is that at just 3 weeks after fertilization, the heart begins to beat. There was actually some research from Oxford a couple of years ago that suggested the heart may begin to beat as early as 16 days after conception, which means that by just the end of the 4th week, the heart has already beaten 1 million times and has been beating ever since for all of us, hopefully still beating now for all of you. We know that the first movements of the baby are from weeks 4 to 5, that it moves by itself. We know that at 6 weeks you can record regulated, coordinated brain waves from the embryo. We know that at 7 weeks it has taste buds and it can hiccup and suck and swallow. We know that at 8 weeks it begins practicing to breathe and it has 90% of the adult structures in the human body. We know that at 9 weeks it can begin to yawn. We know that at 10 weeks it has a good chance that it can feel pain. This is always a bit speculative, but we think there's good evidence it can feel pain from just 10 weeks after conception, which means, of course, it must be conscious by then as well. And some suggest that it can feel pain even earlier at 7 weeks. We know that they can interact socially at 12 weeks, So there's a study showing that when babies are in the womb, they wave their arms around crazily all the time when they're awake or even when they're asleep sometimes. And they will move their arms and slow down when they come to their eyes because their eyes are sensitive and they don't want to hurt them. But what they found was that when there were twins next to each other in the womb, the twins moved their arms around, but when they got to their sibling's head or body, they would slow down so that they didn't hurt their twin. We know that at 14 weeks, if you play a song or sing a song to the baby in the womb, it will respond and it will begin to move its mouth and tongue in response. We know that at, what was next? At taste buds, I think, at 15 weeks, it can taste things. Sorry, not only does it have taste buds, it can actually taste them. And it will remember those tastes after birth. So if a woman has a lot of food, maybe carrots during pregnancy, the baby remembers that taste and will prefer that food usually even after birth. We know that later on in pregnancy, the baby can learn songs. So if you play the same song to a baby in the womb, when it's born, it will remember the song and it will even detect mistakes that you make. If you play the wrong notes, the baby will notice. It can learn rhythm and poems and that sort of thing as well. We know that the baby can recognize the mother's voice in the womb and recognize even the accent and the language. There was a study showing that French babies, as soon as they're born, cry in a French way. Not because they're genetically French, but because they have heard French in the womb. And German babies cried in a German way. And this is all because of what they heard in the womb. And indeed, they can begin to cry even in the womb at just 23 weeks. Now, it's sometimes said that the baby is a parasite, that it does not contribute anything to mother, it just takes from the mother. But there was a discovery a few years ago that shows the relationship is much more interdependent, symbiotic, and intimate than that picture. In fact, as early as 2 to 3 weeks after conception, the baby begins producing stem cells. And of course, many of us have heard about the promise of stem cells for developing medical treatments. Well, it turns out that the baby's stem cells go throughout the mother's body and heal her tissues. They can heal the heart after a heart attack. They can heal the liver after hepatitis. They can heal skin after a wound. They protect against Alzheimer's, and they perform a surveillance function preventing breast cells from becoming cancerous. And this is widely known and universally agreed. Most strikingly, they can even become part of the mother's brain, which means that there are people out there, many people, who have in their brains the cells from their unborn child and use those cells to think. So there are women in the world who think with the cells of her unborn baby to this very day, which is a remarkable thought. So of course this can go wrong. It can cause autoimmune diseases in some cases, but so can the mother's body. The central relationship is one of symbiosis and supporting each other rather than the relationship of a parasite. So I'm not going to show any gruesome pictures. I'm not going to show any pictures of aborted babies, just to alleviate that worry. These are just the pictures from my medical school textbook, the main textbook we use in UK medical schools. This is an unborn baby at 9 weeks after conception. This is one at 11 weeks, and this is one at 18 weeks. And just for contrast, at this stage, in the UK, in the Netherlands, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and many parts of the US, it would be legal to abort this baby for any reason, including just because it is a baby girl. Likewise, this is a video of a baby at 20 weeks with an MRI scanner, and you can even see some of the inside of its brain where it has the cerebrospinal fluid. This is a baby at 20 weeks, which again means that in all of those Western countries, it would be legal to abort this baby for any reason whatsoever, including just because it is a girl. Now, this next video, if you're particularly sensitive, please do look away or close your eyes and I'll tell you when to open them. But this is a baby who is going to have an injection and will feel some pain as a result. It won't be permanent and it's for the baby's benefit. So this is an unborn baby who is going to have surgery in the womb. And because the baby can feel pain, the injection is given as an anesthetic so that it doesn't feel the pain during surgery. And you can see that it cries in response and can clearly feel the pain at 23 weeks. Again, abortion at this stage is legal for any reason in the United Kingdom and several other Western countries. This is just a clearer video. So this is at about 30 weeks, which again in the UK, a baby at this stage could be aborted because it has Down syndrome, because it has a cleft palate, or even just a cleft lip. And you can see again that when the injection is given, the baby is clearly capable of feeling pain. This is from a 4D ultrasound, and you can see it in very clear detail in that video. For anyone who did shut their eyes, you can open your eyes again. Not quite yet, sorry. Okay. You can open your eyes again now. So there, of course, are many difficult questions that I haven't covered. I have 10 hours at least of lecture material on this topic, and some of those questions are very good and very important, and I haven't covered them at all. But I hope I've given you a decent overview of why the pro-life position ultimately is pro-women and is pro-science as well as pro-life. The pro-life view says, reject this narrative that it's the woman against the child. It says that both lives matter. So if you do have further questions, we can have a time of Q&A now, but you can also go to my blog, where I have put together almost every question that I'm ever asked on this topic, and it has all of the answers with the references, with the academic papers, and with the very best quality research on these issues. Finally, Omar kindly described my organization at the start. We work with preventing and protecting women and children from human trafficking, violence against women, and abortion. So if any of you are interested in our work, please do go to our website and see how you can get involved and support us. So thank you so much for your patience. I know it's a difficult topic and a sensitive topic, but I hope that it's been enlightening for you. I hope that it's shown you what the reality of choice is, or so-called choice, in a typical Western country. And so I would encourage you to think about this topic coming up in the Philippines, and think about your own thoughts and how you can do the best to support women and children in this country, because this debate is coming and it is immensely important. So thank you so much, and I'd love to hear any questions you have.
Okay, thank you so much again, Dr. Calum Miller. And of course, we would like to take this opportunity to thank also Word International Ministries Makati here at Ayala Circuit. Ayala Circuit Makati. So if you are free every Sunday, nandito po yung church nila, 5th floor, Ayala Circuit Makati. So we would also like to thank Pastor Obed and Pastor Esguerra for accommodating Ratio Christi, Reasonable Faith, and Burke, Philippines. Okay, so for our Q&A, thank you so much again, Dr. Calum Miller. We are opening the floor for Q&A. You may use this microphone if you would like to ask questions to Dr. Miller, or you may approach us, Omar and I, if you want to let us know about your questions anonymously. But for now, I think we have one question posted online already, coming from David Palima. Are there certain examples in the academia on certain pro-choice articles manipulating the method and methodology to favor their stance? If so, how?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There are actually some very good examples. So maybe the best example is my research topic, which is the question of unsafe abortion. This argument that if abortion is illegal, women will still get abortions, but they will be less safe, and women will die as a result. Now, when you look at the evidence on this, you will often see organizations that support abortion, and even academics, claiming, they might say something like, in the Philippines, 30% of maternal deaths are due to unsafe abortion. A third of every death in pregnancy is because of unsafe abortion. Now, this might have been true in some countries in the 1980s and the 1990s, but there is no evidence for anything like that figure in the current day. So one of the first ways they misrepresent this is by using papers from the 1980s and 1990s and pretending that these are current statistics. The second way they misrepresent the evidence on this is because sometimes they make up these statistics completely. What you find is often a chain of citations that if you keep going back to the sources, you find that the original statistic was just completely made up. And so that's the second way. But the third way is perhaps the most clear. That what many people don't realize is that abortion can mean anything from an induced abortion, which is what we're talking about tonight, to a miscarriage, which is often known as spontaneous abortion. And what you have in many places, particularly in poor places with poorer emergency healthcare, is that women will have a miscarriage, and if the miscarriage is incomplete, parts of the baby will still be inside, and they can cause an infection or they can cause bleeding, which can threaten the woman's life. And some women die as a result of this miscarriage if they don't have the right treatment to evacuate the rest of the baby. Now, those deaths are called deaths from abortion because it's a death from spontaneous abortion. But when you look at the studies, all of them group these together. They say induced abortion and spontaneous abortion are the same deaths. These are all just deaths from abortion. But when you look at some of the advocates for abortion, including in the academic world, they will say, look at all these deaths from unsafe abortion. And so they will use women who die from miscarriage and say that these women had an unsafe abortion and died as a result. And so they will deliberately conflate these statistics in a way which favors abortion because it says all of these women are dying from unsafe abortion, when in fact the reality is that most of them have actually had a miscarriage and would not have benefited from legal abortion. So there are many other examples and many other cases. One example is just people denying that the baby has a heartbeat. So if you go back to my slides on this, it's widely known, and everyone says, this is from the University of Oxford Cardiovascular Research Unit's website. It says very clearly, it doesn't say that there's any dispute about this, when does our heart first start to beat? Until now, researchers thought that the first time our heart muscle contracted to beat was at 8 days after conception, etc. Now a team funded at the University of Oxford has demonstrated earlier beating of the heart, which if extrapolated to the humans is as early as 16 days after conception. But what we see is that many abortion advocates and even academics say that this is not a heartbeat and that no one says that this is a heartbeat. The reality is that it clearly is, and that everyone says this except when they're talking about abortion. In fact, if you go to the Planned Parenthood website for women who keep their babies, it will say at 4 weeks, your baby has a beating heart. So even Planned Parenthood say this, just not when they're talking about abortion. And there are many similar examples. So yes, there are lots of examples of that kind of misrepresentation of the evidence, for sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Calum Miller. So most of the manipulations happening are on the pro-choice side. Okay, thank you. But we have one personal question here. This is actually sensitive. So the person is asking, what about in cases of rape and incest? Could abortion be excusable in these cases? And what is your stand, and why is that your stand?
Sure, thank you for that question. I would say it certainly is understandable, and I would not blame anyone who is in that horrendous situation for thinking about abortion. I think it is a horrendous evil, and that it is absolutely horrific that anyone should go through that position. And we have to be thinking, firstly, as a society, how do we stop this from happening in the first place? How do we prosecute the culprits? And how do we give the women healing in that immensely difficult and horrendous situation that no women should ever be in? And so, of course, abortion is an understandable thought in such a horrific situation. Now, what I would say, firstly, is that I understand if anyone feels that they don't want to listen to anything I say on this topic and they won't find anything convincing that I say because I'm a man who will never be in this position of being pregnant as a result of rape. I completely get that, and if you do feel like nothing I say that could convince you, I don't blame you at all. That's a completely understandable feeling because it will be impossible for me to ever understand just how difficult that situation would be. I could say things about how rape is only a tiny proportion of abortions, less than 1%. I could talk about the children who are born after rape, who say that their lives should not be used to advocate for abortion on demand, and that their lives should have the same legal protection as anyone else, and that when they are told that abortion should be okay in this case, it undermines their equality. I could talk about the mental health evidence that I said earlier that showed that abortion actually harms a woman's mental health further and will not help her. But even then, I get if someone thinks none of that will convince because it just doesn't understand the experience of someone who has been in that position. And so what I would say then is don't listen to me at all. Listen to the voices of women who have been in this situation, because they are the voices who understand the experience and who really get this more than anyone. There was a book published a few years ago by a researcher on abortion and mental health called David Reardon, and he interviewed around 200 women who had become pregnant as the result of rape. And he asked them, what was your experience in your own words? And we often make assumptions. We think that, well, firstly, of course a woman would have an abortion in that situation. It's the obvious choice. And of course, if she has the child, she will constantly be reminded of that trauma, and she will always have that with her life, and she will be in constant trauma and distress from having that child. But when we actually listen to the voices of women in that situation, firstly, he found that the large majority of women kept the baby. And when those women kept the baby, he asked them, did it ruin your life? Did it cause you lifelong trauma? Did it constantly remind you of what you went through? And in fact, what they said was, firstly, not a single woman regretted having the baby, not a single woman. And those women said, in fact, I was in such a dark place with no hope and nothing to live for, and the only thing that gave me something to live for and hope and light in the darkness was that child. It was the only thing that helped me to heal. By contrast, he asked the women who aborted, how do you feel afterwards? And yes, some of them said that they made the right decision, but many of them regretted the decision. And they said, firstly, that this did not help. And that if there's no, I will always have the trauma of the rape. And we dishonor women and we disrespect them and we mislead them if we pretend that by having the abortion, it will just eliminate what happened to them and get rid of their trauma. The reality is it will only ever cover up one of the symptoms. It won't heal the deeper trauma. And so if all it does is get rid of one of the symptoms, in a way, there is not much point, and that is what many of them said. But here is especially what they said. They said that all it did in many cases was add a second victim to the crime, and it added a second trauma to me. And all it did was take away the one thing that could have brought me hope and meaning out of that painful and difficult situation. And so, as I say, you don't have to listen to anything I say about this. I understand completely if nothing I could say could convince you. That makes complete sense, and I get that. But let's not assume how women in this situation feel, and let's listen to their stories. Because I suggest that when we do listen to their stories with an open mind and an open heart, those stories usually point much more towards life as a way of healing and redemption than they do towards abortion, which only covers up the fundamental problem. So thank you for that very good and very important question, and thanks for giving me the chance to answer it.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Miller. That was a very, first you validated the feelings of the women suffering this horrendous event. And of course, you also gave a very winsome answer regarding this issue. Anyone from the audience who would like to ask or respond to Dr. Miller's answers? If none, I can continue reading yung mga private questions that were sent to us. So for, another private question sent was, what are the available services and medications women can have to avoid abortion? Are they accessible to the mass or the masses?
Yeah, thank you, and that's a hugely important question as well. So I can't speak with much kind of specific knowledge of what there is in the Philippines, but what I will say is that the pro-life movement is often caricatured as saying that they don't actually care about the women, they just care about the child being born. The reality is that in the United States, where the pro-lifers are particularly seen as conservative, capitalist, greedy people who don't care about the child after it's born, even there they have 3,000 pregnancy resource centers across the country, outnumbering abortion providers 5 to 1. All of them giving support practically, financially, emotionally, relationally to women in difficult situations. Most of them give support up to the year after the child is born. Many of them give support even 5 years or longer after the child is born. And so there is a huge movement when people take the pro-life position seriously. There is an overwhelming network of support for women in difficult situations. And it's actually when the pro-life movement is weak that we don't see that kind of support. Now, I know in the Philippines, there is the Pregnancy Support Services of Asia, and there are other groups doing individual clinics and support centers like this. Again, I can't say all the detail. I've only been here 5 days. But I would say that there are these centers in the Philippines as well, and there is a network in the Philippines. And if you search the Pregnancy Support Services of Asia, they will have the local points. And Heartbeat International also has affiliates in the Philippines, and they might be able to say where are the local places as well. But of course, we always need more. And civil society groups, churches, charities, universities, all should be doing this work to support the women and the baby once they're born as well. So again, a very important question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. Anyone from the audience who would like to ask a question? If not, I can continue reading.
Please do.
But thank you so much again, Dr. Miller. As for the details of those organizations, I guess it is us who are pro-lifers here in the Philippines who have the responsibility to research about these things and share about the details. In any case, this is the next question, sent anonymously again to us. In a situation where abortion was not done, if a child survives and later on learned that the pregnancy of their mother was unwanted, how do we help children like them in seeing their dignity and value, even if their mother did not want the pregnancy?
Yes, a good question. So I think the first thing I would say is that when we have situations like this, the research shows very clearly that the fundamental kind of feeling of the child is that they're glad to be alive. Now, there's often a big question about what about all these unwanted children? Won't their lives be miserable? There are many studies on this topic that look at unwanted children and their mental health outcomes. And what they actually show is that in almost every case, the child is glad to be alive. And actually, on average, their mental health is the tiniest bit worse than the average child. And I mean the tiniest bit worse. It would be something like the average child may feel bored once a week. The average unwanted child might feel bored twice a week. And that's the only difference between them. In every other way, they're exactly the same. The difference is absolutely minuscule. So the research shows clearly that unwanted children, in fact, firstly, are not unwanted. There are many, many willing parents, especially in the Western world where infertility has increased and there are so few babies to adopt. There are huge waiting lists to adopt children. So every child is wanted, even if not by their biological parents. But we know that those children do ultimately have meaningful lives on the whole and only have slightly worse outcomes than the average child. Now, if there is a child that does come to know that they were unwanted and maybe they were adopted by someone else even, of course, it can cause pain to know that they're unwanted. I'm not denying that any child ever feels that sense of abandonment or anything like that. But I think ultimately, what many children in that situation get some comfort from knowing it is that their parent was in a very difficult situation. In some cases, there is always a link. So we've all seen maybe TV shows where a child is separated from their birth parent and adopted, and later they finally get a message from their birth parent which said, "I always wanted you, I just couldn't take care of you." And so those sorts of things can help. But showing love, if someone is unwanted by their biological parents and always has and always will be, which sadly sometimes does happen, they are always wanted by someone else. by their new parents, by their family, by their friends, by their church, by God. And really the answer is showing that they're wanted and that they're valuable. And everyone else in the society has a duty to show that to them. And so I would say that is the only real solution, is showing that, yes, they may have had abandonment by their parents, and in some cases for bad reasons, and their parents let them down. But they are so precious in themselves because every human life is precious and has dignity and value, including them, and we as a community should be the ones to show that in a concrete way. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller.
Yeah, good evening. And by the way, I'm Pastor RP. Just call me RP. With all the facts that you have given to us tonight, we're so thankful. And it's really awakening. No? Now, there are two facts that I've seen in your presentation. One is that most of those biologists, regardless of their creed, race maybe, or religion or belief, they believe that fetuses at a very early stage are human beings already. And the second fact is, we've come to know that there is an article that says, right to life. Then why is it that until now, so many countries, especially in the Western world, are still doing this? What are your opinions on this, and how are we going to penalize on this countries that disregard this rule in your articles? So that is my question for you.
Thank you. So, I guess, for those people who know the science and admit that this is a human being, there are kind of two main arguments that they can use to try and justify abortion. The first is that although it's a human being, it's not a person. So to be a person, it's not just enough to be a human being, you also have to be conscious, to be rational, to be autonomous, to be self-aware, or something else. And so they would say that only when you reach that mental capacity and ability are you a human being. And so, of course, this has been argued usually by many philosophers. And the problem with it is that it means that usually many infants that are born are not persons. And so many philosophers in fact, the foremost philosophers who support abortion explicitly say fetuses are not rational or self-aware, and abortion is therefore okay. But newborn infants are also not rational or aware, and so infanticide is also okay. And they just admit that infanticide is fine. And so that comes with all sorts of problems, including, if our worth is based on our mental abilities, then why is it that we're all equal? Because all of us have very different mental abilities. Many people are much more intelligent than I am, but they are not more valuable. We all have equal worth regardless of our mental abilities. So if our worth is based on our mental abilities, why are we equal? There's no good explanation of this. And so really, yeah, this has been wrestled with, and as I say, the main ethicists who defend this position end up saying that infanticide is okay, that if someone is particularly disabled mentally, killing them is okay, and so on. Now, the other way of justifying it is through bodily autonomy. And this was the classical argument that even if it's a human being, even if it's a person, it's okay to remove it because they don't have the right to use their body. Now, again, in fact, I want to show a particular response to this. These are two twins. They're conjoined, and sometimes they have their own organs. I think they have two hearts. But sometimes they share an organ, or the organ is only really belonging to one of them. So, for example, they only have one set of intestines. Now, when I ask people, would it be okay, I think they're called Abby and Brittany. I don't know which of them is dependent on who, but one of them is kind of dependent on the other. Say it's Abby. Is it okay for Abby to say one day, Brittany, you're a human being, you're a person, you're my sister, but you're using my body, and I'm going to kill you? Like, no one thinks that is okay. But it's the same situation as pregnancy in many ways. There's an intimate physical connection between their bodies. They are using the organs. In fact, it's even worse than pregnancy because pregnancy ends in 9 months, this invasion of privacy, if you want to call it that, is permanent for the rest of their life. But no one thinks it's okay for Abby to kill her sister because her sister is dependent on her organisms. That's just how their biology works. That's just their natural habitat. It's how they were created. Babies in the womb were created to be in the womb. That's their natural environment. It's where they are supposed to be. They're not invading a new place kind of out of malice or out of, entitlement. That's just where babies begin their life. It's where all of us began in our mother's wombs. And so it's a perfectly natural arrangement, which, yes, does cause difficulty in many cases. And I don't want to undermine that at all. But the reality is that we cannot kill people unless in self-defense. Some people say capital punishment, but generally we cannot kill a human being except in self-defense if they are threatening your life, even if they are causing you a considerable burden, as in this case or in various other cases. So this is really what I would say to the bodily autonomy arguments, but that is often how they try and justify it. So yeah, thank you for that very good question.
Thank you so much, Pastor Artie. Anyone else from our audience would like to ask a question to Dr. Miller? Okay. If not, I'll continue reading the private messages. Okay, so this one is coming from a context of limited resources or even limited influence. What can you suggest as an action plan for people who would like to support pro-life movement and apply it?
Yeah, I would say there's a huge amount that can be done. So, every sector really has to have pro-life people in it, and really there is such a huge range of skills that can be useful. So, we know that there needs to be pro-life politicians, there need to be pro-life celebrities, people pro-life who are in media, including journalists, including producers. We know that there need to be pro-life people creating graphics, creating videos, creating art, doing marketing. We need pro-life people in healthcare and medicine. We need pro-life people in academia and as lawyers, and really in every sector of society. So everyone has something to contribute to the pro-life movement. And there are really so many areas in which to do it: in politics, healthcare, media, practical support for women, churches, and so on. And so I would say, firstly, think about your own skill set and what you're particularly good at and how you could contribute that to the pro-life movement. And then I would say find out about the pro-life movements around in the Philippines. Maybe you want to speak to one of the existing groups like the Pregnancy Support Services of Asia or the Pro-Life Philippines Foundation or Filipinos for Life. Maybe you think that your church or your kind of demographic needs a new pro-life group. So you could start Students for Life or start a pro-life group in my school or church or university. Or you could encourage your church or some other group to create something new and to create an advocacy scheme. Now, if you're particularly interested in doing this at a very advanced level and really advocating with your career and that kind of thing, I'd be more than happy to speak to anyone about that. But really, there are so many ways to advocate, and both in terms of protecting the legal rights of the child and in terms of protecting and supporting the vulnerable mothers, because the pro-life movement needs both of those and is really meaningless without either of them. So there are many ways to get involved, but please speak to others who are involved, speak to me if you're really stuck, and I'd be glad to try and help you find some way of being involved in this.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. And so I encourage even the young people to, in their own way, start their own pro-life movement. Of course, beginning by listening to pro-life talks, such as this one being done by Dr. Miller. Okay, so anyone again from the audience would like to? Okay, one more, Pastor Artie.
Dr. Miller, may I ask if you are a Christian or a believer? You believe in God?
I am, though in this case, I was kind of pro-life before I started following it. So, yeah, I became pro-life in medical school. Really from seeing the arguments, from seeing the reality of unborn life, from seeing the reality of abortion and its effect on women. And that convinced me really without thinking about religion. But later on, I came to kind of yeah, follow the Christian path. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's good to hear that. Because my next question is that, would you agree with me that these countries who are prone in practicing this or legalizing abortion are the countries at which there is a very low knowledge or acceptance that God really exists? Would you agree on that?
I think so. I mean, there's clearly a very big correlation between countries that allow abortion and secularism and lack of religion. But that's not always the case. There are some very religious countries that allow abortion. There are some very atheistic countries. Well, maybe there aren't very atheistic countries that are pro-life, but there are not many very atheistic countries in general. Even in the UK, I think most people would say they believe in God in some vague kind of way. I guess what I would say, though, is that part of the reason for this is because Christianity did actually bring the idea of human equality and human rights in the first place. So it's not just that Christianity brought this kind of anti-abortion, pro-life message. It's that Christianity was the first thing to say every human being is equal in the first place. If you look at Roman society before Christianity, it said that barbarians were less than human, it said that children were less than human, women were less human. I've got some quotes in another presentation. People like Plato. Plato said, when you die, you go back to your star, because he believed that every human being came from a star. And he said, when you die, you go back to your star if you've had a good life and lived, in a virtuous way. But if you haven't lived in a virtuous way, if you've been bad, you will come back to earth as a woman. And Aristotle explicitly said, of course, by nature, man is superior and woman is inferior. Aristotle likewise said about the question of slavery. He said, is it the case that slavery is a natural condition, which is good and just, or has it been kind of socially imposed on people? And he says, well, there's no difficulty in answering this question. It's obvious, the answer. It's obvious that some people were born to be slaves and born to be the property of other human beings. It's just blindingly obvious. Everyone agrees with it. And Christianity was really the movement which said, actually, every human being is made in the image of God. Of course, Judaism said that before, but Judaism didn't spread around the world in the same way. So firstly, it said every human is made in the image of God, which means that it is stamped with the divine seal of approval. And therefore, every human being is ultimately equal. And then Christianity says something else particular, which is that Jesus, God himself, died for every human being. He didn't just die for the king, for the emperor, for the upper class, for men, for free people. He died for the slave, for the woman, for the outcast, for the leper. In the same way, the blood of God himself was worth paying to save the lowest person in society. And so, yes, it is true that the pro-life perspective came into the world through Christianity, but that's not a reason to reject it. In fact, almost everything we have from human rights and human equality came into the world through Christianity. And actually, I think that points more towards the value of Christian ethics and the Christian perspective, rather than pointing away from the pro-life perspective. And I should say, as I said, the scientific facts are not based on Christianity. The fact that life begins at fertilization is not in the Bible, it's just a scientific fact. But Christianity provided the human equality side of the argument. And so if you want to get rid of Christianity, you might want to also think about whether to get rid of human equality. And I think that's a quite dangerous path to go down. And most people, fortunately, don't want to go down that path. So, yeah, thank you.
Any follow-up question, Pastor Artie? Okay na po. Okay. Thank you so much again, Pastor Artie. That was a superb response and grounding it on history and facts as well. Okay, I guess one last question po. This is another one from our private messages. So regarding the care and support for underage pregnant women, what can we do to provide care and support for them? Also considering that these women desire to finish their education, and some of them feel like they have been robbed of their youth because of their pregnancies.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I say the first thing is to get in touch with the existing organizations, and particularly organizations, well, those working with women in difficult pregnancies, but also then look at the specific problems that underage women face when it comes to, for example, completing their education. In some countries around the world, if a girl at school gets pregnant, which is often not her fault, it's often because she has a much older man who promises her food or money in order for sex and to complete her education. But if a girl does get pregnant, she is not allowed to be at school. The school kicks her out. So we have to look at questions like that, see if that occurs in the Philippines. In African countries where that does happen, and probably around the world, but I know it happens in some African countries, one of the solutions in the meantime that they have to that problem is that they have created independent schools for girls who are in this position that are specifically catering for teenage mothers, allowing them to complete their education as well as look after their child. And so a huge part of this is, are we allowing young women who get pregnant to complete their education? We shouldn't be saying to them, actually, you are forced to have a choice. It is a choice between your education and your child, and you are forced to make that choice. We should actually be encouraging women that they can do both and allowing them to do both. So we should be the ones providing means for them to have education as well as having their child, and saying that you are strong and you are powerful, but you also have the support so that you can do both. So again, I can't say much detail on the Philippines because I don't know the specific social and kind of policy environment on this specific question. But I would say that around the world, there have been many solutions to this, and there are many groups working on these kinds of questions that would be able to give some pointers. And of course, they always need more help, financially, through volunteering, and so on. And so if there isn't enough support and you feel passionately about this, one solution is to add one extra volunteer to that work. And so, again, those organizations I mentioned before, like the Pregnancy Support Services of Asia and others, would be great, I think, for making a start with that. But there's always more that can be done. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Any last question from our audience? No one? Okay, I guess you have satisfied inquisitive minds of our people over here in WIN-Makati. But okay, I guess that's it for our Q&A. Thank you so much, Dr. Calum Miller. Can we give him a round of applause, everyone?